March of 1984, 26-year-old photographer Daniel Whitmore disappeared from the coastal town of Bandon, Oregon, after meeting someone to sell a vintage camera. His car was found abandoned on a logging road 20 miles inland, keys still in the ignition, driver's door hanging open. Daniel's camera bag sat untouched on the passenger seat, but Daniel himself had vanished without a trace. 35 years would pass before advances in forensic genealogy and DNA analysis finally identified the person responsible. In the summer of 2019, investigators matched DNA evidence from Daniel's jacket to a genetic profile in a public genealogy database. The breakthrough led them to someone whose connection to Daniel had been hiding in plain sight all along, documented in Daniel's own appointment book. What made the case particularly haunting was a detail that emerged during the trial. The person who killed Daniel had called him again 3 days after his disappearance, leaving a message on his parents' answering machine asking if Daniel was still interested in selling the camera. If you're fascinated by cold cases, where justice finally catches up with those who thought they'd gotten away with murder, please subscribe to our channel. These stories matter. These victims deserve to be remembered. The morning fog rolled thick through Bandon's streets on March 14, 1984, the kind of coastal mist that muffled sound and made the world feel smaller, more intimate. Daniel Whitmore stood in the dark room of the Bandon Chronicle, watching an image slowly materialize in the developing tray. A fishing boat emerging from morning mist, its hull dark against silver water. The chemical smell of the developer mixed with the salt air that crept through every crack in the building. "Danny, you getting those prints done?" Carl Morrison, the Chronicle's editor, called from the newsroom. "Press time's in 2 hours." "Almost there," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the patient calm that made him good at his job. He lifted the print with tongs, studied it under the safe light's amber glow. Not quite right. The contrast needed another 30 seconds in the developer. Daniel had been shooting for the Chronicle for 3 years, since moving back to Bandon after a brief stint in Portland. The city had been too loud, too fast, too many photographers competing for too few jobs. Bandon offered something different. Here, his camera captured a world most people overlooked. The weathered hands of fishermen mending nets, storm waves crashing against face rock, the annual cranberry harvest, workers bent low in flooded bogs. But what Daniel loved most happened after hours, in the cramped studio apartment above the hardware store where he restored vintage cameras. Folders, Hasselblads, old Leicas with brass fittings gone green with age. He'd buy broken cameras at estate sales and flea markets, then spend evenings bringing them back to life, cleaning fungus from lenses, replacing deteriorated light seals, calibrating shutters until they fired with the precise mechanical click they'd made decades ago. Last week, he'd finished restoring a 1954 Rolleiflex, twin-lens beauty, with a taking lens sharp as the day it left the Hamburg factory. He'd placed an ad in the Oregonian classifieds. Restored 1954 Rolleiflex TLR, museum quality, asking $400, serious collectors only. 3 people had called. 2 were tire kickers who gasped at the price. The third caller, a man named Robert, had asked informed questions about the lens coating, the shutter speeds, whether the viewing screen had been replaced. They'd agreed to meet today, Wednesday, at 2 o'clock. Daniel had suggested meeting at his apartment, but Robert said he'd be driving down from Salem and needed to head back the same day. Could they meet somewhere along Highway 101? Maybe at the turnoff to Whiskey Run Beach? Daniel had agreed, though something about the request nagged at him. Most serious collectors wanted to see your workspace, your other cameras, to verify you weren't some fly-by-night flipper. But $400 was $400. The money would cover 3 months of darkroom supplies, maybe let him finally buy that enlarger lens he'd been eyeing. Daniel checked his watch. 1:15. He needed to finish these prints, grab lunch, then drive to the meeting spot. The Whiskey Run turnoff was only 20 minutes north, but he wanted to arrive early, check out the location. Photography had taught him to scout a scene before committing to it. He pulled the final print from the developer, slid it into the stop bath. The image locked, permanent now. A moment captured and preserved. Daniel wondered sometimes if that's what drew him to both photography and camera restoration. The idea that moments could be saved, that time didn't have to be lost forever. At 1:30, Daniel locked up the darkroom and headed to his apartment. The fog was lifting, revealing a sky the color of old paper. March in Bandon meant changeable weather, clear one moment, raining the next. He grabbed his jacket, the worn denim one with the Nikon patch on the sleeve. In his camera bag, he carefully packed the Rolleiflex, wrapped in soft cloth, along with the original leather case and instruction manual he'd tracked down at an estate sale in Eugene. His roommate, Kevin, was heating soup on the hot plate. "You heading out to that camera sale?" "Yeah, should be back by 4. You want me to come along? This guy's a stranger." Daniel shook his head. "It's broad daylight, public place. I'll be fine." It was the kind of casual confidence that came from growing up in a small town where people still left their doors unlocked, where strangers were just neighbors you hadn't met yet. Daniel had covered crime scenes for the Chronicle, but they were always the aftermath of domestic disputes or drunk driving accidents. Random violence, stranger danger, that was something from TV news in Portland, not real life in Bandon. He drove north in his Datsun pickup, windows cracked to let in the ocean air. The tape deck played a mixtape Sarah had made him before she moved to Seattle last year. Bruce Springsteen, Tom Petty, Bob Seger. Songs about small towns and big dreams and roads that led somewhere else. The Whiskey Run turnoff was exactly where Robert had described it. A gravel parking area large enough for maybe 6 cars, with a trail leading down through shore pines toward the beach. One vehicle sat in the lot, a dark blue Ford van with Washington plates. As Daniel pulled in, a man climbed out of the van. Tall, maybe 6'2", with sandy hair going gray at the temples. He wore slacks and a dress shirt, like he'd come from an office job. Wire-rimmed glasses, a canvas messenger bag slung over one shoulder. "Daniel?" The man extended his hand. "Robert Childers. Thanks for driving up." "No problem." Daniel shook his hand, noting the firm grip, the clean fingernails. Up close, Robert looked to be in his early 40s, with the kind of generic handsomeness that made him forgettable. The kind of face that blended into crowds. "You brought the Rollie?" "Right here." Daniel pulled the camera from his bag, unwrapped it carefully. Robert's eyes lit up, and for the next 10 minutes, they talked cameras. Robert knew his stuff, asking about the Tessar lens, the film advance mechanism, whether Daniel had tested the shutter speeds with a timing device. He held the camera like someone who understood its value, his fingers finding the controls with practiced ease. "This is beautiful work," Robert said finally. "The restoration is really first-rate. I've been collecting twin lens reflexes for 15 years, and this is among the nicest I've seen." Daniel felt the small warmth of pride. "Thanks. It took about 6 weeks to get it right. Listen, I know we agreed on 400, but I only brought 350 in cash. I've got a checkbook if you want the rest by check, or I could mail you a money order next week." Daniel hesitated. 350 was still good money, and Robert seemed legitimate. Camera collectors could be eccentric about payment methods. Some refused to use checks, paranoid about fraud. Cash works. 350's fine. Robert smiled, reached for his messenger bag. Great. Actually, I've got something else you might be interested in. I picked up a box lot at an estate sale last month, mostly junk, but there's a Zeiss icon folder that just needs a new bellows. You do that kind of work? Yeah, definitely. It's in my van. Let me grab it. You can take a look. Robert walked to the van's rear doors. Daniel followed, his camera bag bouncing against his hip. The beach trail looked inviting in the afternoon light. If he had time after this, maybe he'd walk down, shoot a few frames of the surf. The Chronicle always needed stock images for slow news days. Robert opened the van's back doors. The interior was mostly empty, just some cardboard boxes and what looked like camping equipment. It's in this box here, Robert said, leaning in, moving things around. Yeah, here it is. Daniel stepped closer, peering into the dim interior. He didn't see Robert's hand moving behind the boxes. Didn't see the tire iron until it was already in motion, a dark blur in his peripheral vision. The impact caught him above the left ear, a white flash of pain and shock. Daniel's legs buckled. He tried to grab the van door, to pull himself up, but his fingers wouldn't work right. The world tilted, and he was falling, Robert's hands catching him, guiding him into the van's cargo area. Daniel tried to speak, to ask why, but his mouth wasn't working. His vision was narrowing, sounds becoming muffled and distant. The last thing he registered was the van doors slamming shut, cutting off the daylight, and the engine starting with a rough diesel cough. Then darkness, complete and absolute. Kevin started worrying around 5:30. Daniel had said he'd be back by 4. Traffic from the coast could be unpredictable, but not 90 minutes late, unpredictable. By 6 o'clock, Kevin called the Chronicle. No, Carl said. Daniel hadn't come back to drop off the camera money. At 7, Kevin called Daniel's parents, Jim and Carol Whitmore, who lived 10 minutes away. I'm sure he's fine, Carol said, but her voice carried an edge of concern. Maybe his truck broke down and he's waiting for a tow. But at 8 o'clock, when full darkness had settled over Bandon and Daniel still hadn't returned, Jim Whitmore called the Coos County Sheriff's Office. The dispatcher took down the information with professional calm. 26-year-old male, last seen leaving his apartment around 1:45. Supposed to meet someone about a camera sale near Whiskey Run Beach. Driving a blue 1979 Datsun pickup, Oregon plate number GHT 472. The dispatcher promised to send a deputy to check the meeting location, but her tone suggested this wasn't yet an emergency. Young men were allowed to be late. Maybe he'd met friends, lost track of time. Maybe he'd driven to Coos Bay for dinner. These things usually resolved themselves by morning. But Deputy Frank Morrison, who drove up to Whiskey Run around 9 that night, found something that changed the situation immediately. Daniel's Datsun sat alone in the gravel parking area, driver's door open, dome light long since drained to nothing. The keys hung in the ignition. Daniel's camera bag sat on the passenger seat, undisturbed. On the dashboard, a road atlas lay open to the Coos County page. Morrison called it in, then walked the perimeter with his flashlight. No signs of struggle in the parking area. No blood, no scuff marks, nothing disturbed. He walked the beach trail, calling Daniel's name, his voice swallowed by the sound of surf. Nothing. At the beach, he checked for footprints, but the tide was coming in, erasing whatever marks might have existed. Back at the truck, Morrison looked inside more carefully, not touching anything. The camera bag contained lenses, film canisters, a light meter. In the glove box, Daniel's registration and insurance card. Under the passenger seat, a roll of mints and an empty coffee cup from the Minute Market in Bandon. What wasn't there told the story. No wallet, no keys to his apartment, no restored camera, the one Kevin said Daniel had been planning to sell. Morrison radioed the sheriff. "We've got a problem at Whiskey Run. I've got an abandoned vehicle, belongings inside, no sign of the driver. Looks hinky." By midnight, the parking area blazed with portable lights powered by a generator from the fire department. Sheriff Tom Bradley stood beside Daniel's truck, watching technicians dust for fingerprints. Who was he meeting? Jim Whitmore, who'd driven up with Carol, pulled out a small appointment book. His roommate found this in Daniel's apartment. March 14th, 2 p.m. It says, "Robert, Raleigh Sale, Whiskey Run." That's all? Robert have a last name? The roommate said Daniel mentioned he was from Salem. That's all we know. Bradley looked at the dark forest pressing in around the parking area, at the trail leading down to invisible surf. In 30 years of law enforcement, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Right now, those instincts were screaming that Daniel Whitmore wasn't lost or confused or sleeping off a drunk somewhere. Something bad had happened in this parking lot. "Let's get a search organized for First Light," he said. "Dogs, volunteers, the whole works, and someone call the Oregonian in Portland. Find out if they keep records of classified ads, who placed them, contact information." The search began at dawn on March 15th, 40 volunteers spreading through the coastal forest around Whiskey Run. The morning air carried the smell of salt and wet earth, and a light rain began falling as the teams assembled in the parking lot. Sheriff Bradley organized them into grid patterns, each team assigned a specific sector to cover. Search and rescue teams from Coos, Curry, and Douglas counties arrived with dogs trained in cadaver detection and live tracking. The dogs worked the beach trail first, noses to the ground, handlers watching for any sign of interest. Nothing. They worked the parking area, circling Daniel's truck repeatedly. One dog showed brief interest near the rear of the vehicle, but then moved on, unable to pick up a trail that led anywhere. The Coast Guard dispatched a boat to run the shoreline, searching the rocks and tide pools for any sign that Daniel might have fallen or jumped. The cliffs here rose 30 feet above the water, and accidents happened, especially on foggy days when you couldn't see the edge clearly. But the coastline revealed nothing. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through the shore pines and Sitka spruce, calling Daniel's name, checking behind fallen logs, looking into ravines. The rain picked up, turning the forest floor muddy, making the work harder. By noon, everyone was soaked and cold, but no one suggested stopping. Jim Whitmore walked with one of the search teams, his face gray, his voice hoarse from calling his son's name. Carol stayed back at the command post, a folding table set up in the parking lot where coordinators marked off sectors as they were cleared. She kept Daniel's photograph in her hands, showing it to every volunteer who arrived, as if seeing his face might help them search harder. On the second day, they expanded the search radius to 10 miles, incorporating logging roads that threaded through the Coast Range. The forest here was dense, second-growth timber mixed with older stands, the understory thick with salal and ferns. Volunteers checked abandoned logging camps, old hunters' blinds, culverts under logging roads, anywhere a body might have been hidden or discarded. They found a homeless camp 2 miles inland, 3 men living in a makeshift shelter of tarps and plywood. The men were cooperative, even joining the search briefly, but they'd seen nothing, heard nothing. One of them remembered seeing a dark van on the logging road 3 days earlier, but he couldn't recall the make or model, couldn't say which direction it had been heading. On the third day, a tracking dog picked up a scent on a logging road 4 miles east of Whiskey Run. The dog followed it for half a mile before losing it where the road crossed a creek. Divers searched the creek, wading through water barely above freezing, feeling along the muddy bottom. They found logging debris, old tires, beer cans, but no body, no clothing, nothing connected to Daniel. By the evening of the third day, Sheriff Bradley had to make the call. They'd covered a 15-mile radius now, checked every accessible location, followed every lead. They'd found nothing. The search transitioned from rescue to recovery, and even that had to be scaled back as volunteers returned to jobs and families. But the investigation continued. Deputies canvassed every business along Highway 101 from Bandon to Reedsport, showing Daniel's photograph, asking if anyone had seen him on March 14th. A gas station attendant in Charleston remembered someone matching Daniel's description buying coffee that morning. A waitress at a diner in Coos Bay thought maybe she'd seen him, but couldn't be sure. They interviewed everyone Daniel knew. Friends from high school described him as reliable, thoughtful, not someone who'd leave without telling anyone. Co-workers at the Chronicle said he'd been in good spirits lately, excited about finishing the Rolleiflex restoration, talking about saving up for better equipment. His ex-girlfriend Sarah, reached by phone in Seattle, broke down crying. "Danny wouldn't just leave," she said. "Something happened to him. Someone did something." The physical evidence from Daniel's truck went to the state crime lab in Portland. Fingerprints were lifted from the steering wheel, door handles, dashboard. Most matched Daniel, but there were partial prints on the driver's side door that didn't. The problem was, partials weren't useful without a suspect to compare them to. The fabric from the driver's seat showed transfer evidence, skin cells and hair that DNA analysis confirmed came from someone other than Daniel. But in 1984, DNA analysis was still experimental, and the sample was too small for reliable testing with the technology available. The swabs were carefully preserved, labeled, stored in an evidence box that would sit untouched for more than 30 years. They found tire tracks in the muddy pull-off near where Daniel's truck was parked. Casting revealed a common tire pattern, sold at hundreds of shops across the Pacific Northwest. Useful for confirming a vehicle had been there, useless for identifying which specific vehicle. The investigation revealed Daniel's routine, his habits, his character. He was careful with money, saving most of what he earned at the Chronicle for equipment upgrades. He didn't drink much, didn't use drugs, had no gambling debts or financial troubles. His relationship with Sarah had ended amicably when she moved to Seattle for grad school. They still talked on the phone occasionally, still cared about each other. He had no enemies. That's what everyone said, over and over. Daniel Whitmore had no enemies. He was quiet, friendly, professional, kind to elderly people who came into the Chronicle to place death notices, patient with tourists asking for photo recommendations, generous with aspiring photographers who wanted to learn. "That's what makes this so hard," Sheriff Bradley told reporters 2 weeks into the investigation. "We've got a victim everyone liked, no obvious motive, no evidence of where he went after his truck was abandoned. It's like he stepped out of his vehicle and vanished into thin air." But people don't vanish into thin air. Sheriff Bradley knew that. Someone had been at that parking lot. Someone had interacted with Daniel. Someone knew what happened. Finding that someone was the problem. The Oregonian's advertising department confirmed that someone had placed the Rolleiflex ad in their March 10th edition. The ad had been placed by phone on March 8th, paid for with cash that arrived by mail the next day. No name, just a post office box return address in Salem that turned out to be fake. The contact number listed was a payphone outside a 7-Eleven in Salem. Deputies drove to Salem, located the payphone, interviewed the 7-Eleven clerk on duty. She was a tired woman in her 50s who worked the night shift and couldn't remember anyone specific using that phone. Hundreds of people use it, she said. Truckers, teenagers, people whose phone got cut off. I don't pay attention unless they're causing trouble. They pulled phone records for that payphone, hoping to find a pattern. The problem was payphones generated volumes of calls, and 1984 phone records didn't include the same level of detail modern systems tracked. They could see that calls were made, but not to where, not for how long. They checked other Rolleiflex ads in the Oregonian from the previous 6 months, looking for similar patterns. 2 other ads had been placed for vintage cameras, both with legitimate sellers who checked out clean. One of them mentioned he'd had several calls from tire kickers who asked detailed questions, but never showed up to buy. It's common, he told deputies. Collectors are particular. They'll ask about every scratch, every speck of dust. Investigators theorized that whoever placed the ad wasn't just interested in Daniel's specific camera. They were testing a method. Place an ad, see who calls, identify potential targets. Someone selling a valuable camera would likely meet alone, would be carrying cash or expensive equipment, would go to isolated locations for the transaction. They checked other missing persons cases in Oregon and Washington, looking for similar patterns. A guitar dealer had disappeared from Portland in 1982 after arranging to sell a vintage Martin to a buyer who'd responded to a classified ad. A stamp collector had vanished in 1981 from Eugene under similar circumstances. But those cases had gone cold with even less evidence than Daniel's. No bodies, no witnesses, no DNA. Sheriff Bradley requested FBI assistance, suggesting they might be looking at a serial predator who used classified ads to target victims. The FBI profiler who reviewed the case agreed it was possible, but without more connections between the cases, without bodies or crime scenes to analyze, there wasn't much they could do beyond add it to their database of unsolved disappearances. The Oregonian agreed to flag any future ads for vintage cameras placed from payphones or with suspicious payment methods. But weeks passed, then months, and no similar ads appeared. Either the person had stopped, or moved to different newspapers, or changed their method entirely. Investigators canvassed every camera shop and photography club in Oregon and Washington, showing them photos of the Rolleiflex, asking if anyone had tried to sell it. Nothing. They checked pawn shops from Portland to the California border. Nothing. They interviewed every Robert Childers they could find in Salem and surrounding areas. None owned a dark blue Ford van. None had any interest in vintage cameras. The case made regional news for a week, then faded as newer tragedies took its place. Jim and Carol Whitmore never stopped searching. They hired a private investigator who exhausted their savings, finding nothing. They distributed flyers at every camera show on the West Coast for the next decade. They maintained a tip line that rang less and less frequently as years became decades. Kevin moved out of the apartment, unable to stay in the space where Daniel's camera equipment still sat, waiting for its owner to return. He never quite shook the guilt of letting Daniel go alone to that meeting. The Chronicle ran an anniversary story every year on March 14th. Local photographer still missing. Then, missing photographer case remains unsolved. Eventually, the stories stopped because there was nothing new to report, nothing left to say that hadn't been said 100 times. Daniel's case file grew thick with reports and dead ends. Every few years, a new detective would pull it, hoping fresh eyes might see something previous investigators had missed. But the evidence always led to the same conclusion. Daniel had met someone who called himself Robert. That person had lured him to a remote location. That person had taken him somewhere else. What happened after that, no one could say. By 2010, Daniel Whitmore had been missing for 26 years. His parents were in their 70s now, still hoping but no longer expecting answers. The detectives who'd worked the original case had retired or died. The evidence boxes sat in a climate-controlled storage facility, carefully preserved but rarely accessed. The case made regional news for a week, Daniel's photograph appearing on evening broadcasts from Eugene to Portland. Local photographer missing after camera sale meetup. The Chronicle ran a front-page story, Carl Morrison writing it himself, his voice raw with emotion as he described Daniel's dedication to his craft, his kindness to colleagues, the mystery of his disappearance. Tips came in. People called saying they'd seen someone matching Daniel's description at a rest stop in California, at a bus station in Seattle, hitchhiking near Mount Shasta. Every tip had to be followed up, every sighting investigated. None led anywhere. People saw what they wanted to see, or misremembered, or were simply mistaken. Jim and Carol Whitmore couldn't accept that Daniel was gone without answers. They hired a private investigator, Frank Novak, who'd retired from the Portland Police Department with a reputation for thoroughness. Novak spent 6 months on the case, burning through the Whitmore's savings. He interviewed everyone Daniel had ever known, going back to elementary school. He tracked down every person who'd placed ads for vintage cameras in Pacific Northwest newspapers over the previous 2 years. He spent weeks at the county clerk's office, pulling property records for land along that logging road where the tracking dog had briefly picked up a scent. Novak found abandoned cabins, hunting camps, old homesteads that hadn't been occupied in years. He checked every single one, hiking miles into the forest, searching abandoned structures for any sign Daniel had been held there. He found evidence of squatters, teenagers using the cabins for parties, hunters who'd left trash behind, but nothing connected to Daniel. "I'm sorry," Novak finally told the Whitmores in September 1984. "I've exhausted every lead I can find. Without new evidence, without someone coming forward, I don't know where else to look." But Jim and Carol couldn't stop. They printed 10,000 flyers with Daniel's photograph and detailed description, along with a sketch of what the Rolleiflex camera looked like. They distributed them at every camera shop, camera show, photography club meeting they could find from Vancouver to San Diego. Carol learned to use a computer so she could join early internet forums where photographers discussed vintage cameras. She posted about Daniel, described the Rolleiflex, asked people to watch for it. Some people were sympathetic, offering prayers and hope. Others got annoyed at what they saw as spam, complaining about a grieving mother who wouldn't accept reality. Jim drove the logging roads around Whiskey Run every weekend for 3 years, covering hundreds of miles, checking every turnoff, every clearing, walking into the forest wherever roads ended. He carried Daniel's photograph in his wallet, showing it to loggers, to hunters, to anyone he encountered. "Have you seen my son? Have you seen this camera?" The strain took its toll. Jim had a heart attack in 1987, forcing him to stop the physical searches. Carol kept going alone, though now she was in her 50s and the forest was harder to navigate. She slipped on a muddy slope in 1988, breaking her ankle, spending 6 weeks in a cast and another 6 in physical therapy. They set up a tip line, paying for it out of Jim's disability checks. The phone rang less frequently as years passed, but Carol answered every call, took every tip seriously, reported them all to the sheriff's office. Most were well-meaning people who'd seen the anniversary stories in the Chronicle and wanted to help. Some were psychics claiming visions. A few were cruel, people who got enjoyment from making false claims, saying they knew where Daniel was buried, asking for money to reveal the location. Carol learned to tell the difference between genuine tips and false ones, but it took an emotional toll every time. Hope rising with each call, then crashing when the tip led nowhere. The disappointment became harder to bear as years accumulated. The 5th anniversary of Daniel's disappearance brought renewed media attention. The Chronicle ran a feature story. 5 years later, photographer's fate still unknown. Local TV news did segments. For a few weeks, the tip line got busier. New leads came in. All of them went nowhere. Kevin, Daniel's former roommate, moved to Portland in 1986, unable to stay in Bandon, where everything reminded him of his friend. He called Carol on Daniel's birthday every year, the two of them sharing memories, keeping Daniel alive in conversation. Kevin married, had children, built a life, but he never quite forgave himself for letting Daniel go alone to that meeting. The Chronicle continued running anniversary stories, though they grew shorter as years passed. Missing photographer case remains unsolved. Decade-old mystery still haunts coastal town. 20 years later, family still searches for answers. Each story brought a brief flurry of interest, a few new tips, then silence again. The case file in the sheriff's office grew thicker with dead-end reports. Detectives changed, new ones inheriting the case, reading through the accumulated evidence, finding nothing previous investigators had missed. In the early 1990s, a new detective named Mike Hassan decided to review the case with fresh eyes. He spent 3 months going through every piece of evidence, every interview transcript, every tip that had been called in. He found the same conclusion everyone else had reached. Daniel had met someone calling themselves Robert. That person had taken him somewhere. What happened after that was speculation. Hassan decided to try something different. He got permission to submit Daniel's case to the FBI's National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime, hoping their profilers might see patterns others had missed. The analysis came back 6 months later with a psychological profile of the likely suspect. Male, probably white, age 30-50 in 1984. Organized, methodical, comfortable lying to strangers. Likely had legitimate reason to be on remote roads, maybe a salesman or delivery driver. Possibly had previous contact with law enforcement for lesser crimes, but had avoided serious charges. The killing might have been opportunistic rather than planned, a robbery gone wrong, panic overriding common sense. The profile matched 10,000 men in the Pacific Northwest. Without more specific information, it was just educated guessing. Through it all, Carol maintained Daniel's apartment above the hardware store exactly as he'd left it. His cameras sat on the shelf, his darkroom chemicals stored properly, though unused. She couldn't bear to pack it up, couldn't accept that he wouldn't walk through that door someday. The rent was cheap, and the hardware store owner, who'd known Daniel, never pressured her to clear out the space. Every year on Daniel's birthday, March 8th, Carol would go to the apartment, sit in his chair, look through his photographs. She'd talk to him, tell him about her day, about changes in the town, about people he'd known. It became a ritual, a way of keeping him present, refusing to let him fade into the past. Friends worried about her, gently suggested that maybe it was time to accept Daniel was gone, to move on. But how could she move on when she didn't know? Not knowing was its own kind of torture, different from grief, harder in some ways. Grief you could process, could work through. Not knowing just hung there, suspended, never resolving. Jim dealt with it differently. He stopped talking about Daniel after the first few years, shut down emotionally, threw himself into his job at the lumber mill until the heart attack forced him to retire. Then he spent his days in the garage, working on small engines, fixing things for neighbors, keeping his hands busy so his mind wouldn't wander to dark places. The Whitmore's marriage survived, but it was strained. They dealt with grief in opposite ways. Carol keeping everything open and raw, Jim bottling everything up. Some nights they'd sit in silence, The TV playing unwatched, both of them thinking about Daniel, but not speaking about him. The absence between them wider than words could cross. The private investigator Novak, who'd worked the case in 1984, kept in touch with the Whitmores even after his paid work ended. He'd call on anniversaries, asking if there was anything new. He'd follow up on tips that seemed promising, doing it pro bono because he cared, because he'd gotten invested, because a case like this didn't let you go. In 1995, Novak contacted the Whitmores with new information. Advances in DNA analysis meant the swabs taken from Daniel's truck in 1984 could now be tested more accurately. The sheriff's office agreed to send the samples to a private lab that specialized in cold cases. The results came back, confirming what they'd known. The DNA wasn't Daniel's, belonged to someone else, but without a suspect to compare it to, the information was useless. When they catch whoever did this, Novak told Carol, that DNA will seal the conviction. It's just a matter of finding them. But years kept passing. The 20th anniversary came and went. Daniel would have been 46 years old, probably married, maybe with children, definitely still making photographs. Carol imagined the life he might have lived, all the moments he'd missed, all the photographs he'd never taken. The turn of the millennium brought a surge of interest in cold cases as TV shows and documentaries popularized the genre. The Chronicle was contacted by producers interested in featuring Daniel's disappearance. Carol and Jim debated whether to participate. Would it help, bringing renewed attention to the case? Or would it just reopen wounds that hadn't healed? They agreed to one documentary that aired on a regional cable channel in 2002. The producers were respectful, focusing on Daniel's life and work rather than sensationalizing his disappearance. The show generated a few new tips, people who'd moved to Oregon after 1984 and hadn't known about the case. Again, nothing led anywhere. By 2010, Daniel had been missing for 26 years. His parents were in their 70s now, Jim's health declining, Carol slowing down, but still determined. The case file in the sheriff's office ran to thousands of pages. A mountain of dead ends and false leads and procedures followed perfectly, but yielding nothing. The detectives who'd worked the original investigation had retired or died. Sheriff Bradley passed away in 2003, taking with him the memory of standing in that parking lot in March 1984, knowing in his gut that something terrible had happened. Carl Morrison from the Chronicle died in 2007, never knowing what became of the young photographer he'd mentored. Kevin, Daniel's former roommate, visited Bandon in 2010, bringing his teenage son to show him where he'd grown up. They stopped at the Whitmore house, and Kevin introduced his son to Carol. "This is my friend Daniel's mother," he said. "Daniel was one of the best people I ever knew." The boy asked what happened to Daniel, and Carol told the story again, carefully edited for a teenager's ears. The boy listened with wide eyes, then asked, "Don't they have DNA now? Can't they use that to find who did it?" Kevin and Carol shared a sad look. "DNA only works if you have someone to compare it to," Carol explained. "We have DNA from Daniel's truck, but unless the person gets arrested for something else and their DNA goes into the system, we might never know." But that conversation stuck with Carol. DNA was advancing rapidly, new techniques being developed. Maybe someday there would be a breakthrough. Maybe someday science would catch up with whoever had taken her son. That breakthrough came in 2015, though it would take 4 more years before its full impact was felt. The FBI expanded its combined DNA index system, CODIS, encouraging law enforcement agencies nationwide to upload DNA evidence from unsolved cases. The Coos County Sheriff's Office responded, digitizing and uploading evidence from over 200 cold cases, including the swabs from Daniel's truck. The DNA profile went into CODIS in October 2015, compared against millions of samples from convicted criminals and arrestees. No matches. Whoever had sat in Daniel's truck had never been arrested for a serious crime, or had committed crimes before DNA collection became standard. The case might have remained cold indefinitely if not for a parallel revolution happening outside law enforcement. Genealogy had become a popular hobby, with millions of people uploading their DNA to websites like Ancestry.com, 23andMe, and GED Match to find relatives and explore their heritage. In April 2018, this genealogy trend intersected dramatically with law enforcement. California investigators announced they'd arrested a suspect in the Golden State Killer case, a serial rapist and murderer from the 1970s and 80s. The break came from genetic genealogy, uploading the killer's DNA to GED Match, finding distant relatives, then building a family tree backward to identify a suspect. The announcement sent shockwaves through law enforcement. Cold cases with DNA evidence but no suspects could suddenly be approached from an entirely new angle. You didn't need the killer in CODIS. You just needed their second or third cousins to have uploaded their DNA to a public genealogy site. Detective Sarah Chen of the Coos County Sheriff's Office read about the Golden State Killer breakthrough with growing excitement. She'd grown up in Bandon, remembered Daniel's disappearance as local legend, the photographer who vanished. She'd joined the sheriff's office in 2008, and one of her first assignments had been reviewing the cold case files. Daniel's case had haunted her ever since. In January 2019, Chen pitched the idea of using genetic genealogy to her captain. The cost was several $1,000s, but for a case this old with evidence this solid, it seemed worth trying. The captain agreed, and Chen contacted Bandon Nanolabs, a Virginia company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In March 2019, exactly 35 years after Daniel disappeared, Bandon uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch. Within hours, matches appeared. Dozens of people who shared genetic material with whoever had sat in Daniel's truck. Each match was a thread in a family tapestry that, if traced correctly, would lead to a name. Genealogist C.C. Moore began the painstaking work of building the family tree. She started with the closest matches, working backward through generations using census records, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries. Every connection had to be verified, every relationship documented. The work took months. By April, Moore identified a family line pointing to German immigrants who'd settled in Washington in the 1890s. By May, she'd narrowed it to a specific branch. By July, she'd compiled a list of 17 men descended from this line who would have been the right age in 1984. Chen began investigating each man systematically. Where were they living in March 1984? What was their occupation? Did they own vehicles matching witness descriptions? 3 had died since 1984. 7 had solid alibis. That left 7 candidates. Chen narrowed her focus, pulling detailed records. 1 had been in prison in Montana. Another had been 16 in 1984. Possible but unlikely. By July 2019, 3 prime candidates remained. The first was eliminated when records confirmed he'd been in California on March 14, 1984. The second was possible but lacked clear connections to Oregon's coast. The third was Robert Keller, age 62, living in Olympia, Washington. Chen pulled Robert's 1984 driver's license photo. Sandy hair going gray, wire-rimmed glasses, generic features. She checked his employment history. Pharmaceutical sales representative in 1984, territory covering Oregon's coast. She checked vehicle registrations. In 1984, he'd owned a dark blue Ford Econoline van. Everything fit. The appearance, the occupation, the vehicle, the territory. Chen felt the electric charge of recognition, the moment when scattered pieces suddenly formed a picture. But feeling wasn't proof. She needed Robert Keller's DNA. They set up a tip line, paying for it out of Jim's disability checks. The phone rang less frequently as years passed, but Carol answered every call, took every tip seriously, reported them all to the sheriff's office. Most were well-meaning people who'd seen the anniversary stories in the Chronicle and wanted to help. Some were psychics claiming visions. A few were cruel, people who got enjoyment from making false claims, saying they knew where Daniel was buried, asking for money to reveal the location. Carol learned to tell the difference between genuine tips and false ones, but it took an emotional toll every time. Hope rising with each call, then crashing when the tip led nowhere. The disappointment became harder to bear as years accumulated. The 5th anniversary of Daniel's disappearance brought renewed media attention. The Chronicle ran a feature story. 5 years later, photographer's fate still unknown. Local TV news did segments. For a few weeks, the tip line got busier. New leads came in. All of them went nowhere. Kevin, Daniel's former roommate, moved to Portland in 1986, unable to stay in Bandon where everything reminded him of his friend. He called Carol on Daniel's birthday every year, the two of them sharing memories, keeping Daniel alive in conversation. Kevin married, had children, built a life, but he never quite forgave himself for letting Daniel go alone to that meeting. The Chronicle continued running anniversary stories, though they grew shorter as years passed. Missing photographer case remains unsolved. Decade-old mystery still haunts coastal town. 20 years later, family still searches for answers. Each story brought a brief flurry of interest, a few new tips, then silence again. The case file in the sheriff's office grew thicker with dead-end reports. Detectives changed, new ones inheriting the case, reading through the accumulated evidence, finding nothing previous investigators had missed. In the early 1990s, a new detective named Mike Hassan decided to review the case with fresh eyes. He spent 3 months going through every piece of evidence, every interview transcript, every tip that had been called in. He found the same conclusion everyone else had reached. Daniel had met someone calling themselves Robert. That person had taken him somewhere. What happened after that was speculation. Hassan decided to try something different. He got permission to submit Daniel's case to the FBI's National Center for Analysis of Violent Crime, hoping their profilers might see patterns others had missed. The analysis came back 6 months later with a psychological profile of the likely suspect. Male, probably white, age 30-50 in 1984. Organized, methodical, comfortable lying to strangers. Likely had legitimate reason to be on remote roads, maybe a salesman or delivery driver. Possibly had previous contact with law enforcement for lesser crimes, but had avoided serious charges. The killing might have been opportunistic rather than planned, a robbery gone wrong, panic overriding common sense. The profile matched 10,000 men in the Pacific Northwest. Without more specific information, it was just educated guessing. Through it all, Carol maintained Daniel's apartment above the hardware store exactly as he'd left it. His cameras sat on the shelf, his darkroom chemicals stored properly, though unused. She couldn't bear to pack it up, couldn't accept that he wouldn't walk through that door someday. The rent was cheap, and the hardware store owner, who'd known Daniel, never pressured her to clear out the space. Every year on Daniel's birthday, March 8th, Carol would go to the apartment, sit in his chair, look through his photographs. She'd talk to him, tell him about her day, about changes in the town, about people he'd known. It became a ritual, a way of keeping him present, refusing to let him fade into the past. Friends worried about her, gently suggested that maybe it was time to accept Daniel was gone, to move on. But how could she move on when she didn't know? Not knowing was its own kind of torture, different from grief, harder in some ways. Grief you could process, could work through. Not knowing just hung there, suspended, never resolving. Jim dealt with it differently. He stopped talking about Daniel after the first few years, shut down emotionally, threw himself into his job at the lumber mill until the heart attack forced him to retire. Then he spent his days in the garage, working on small engines, fixing things for neighbors, keeping his hands busy so his mind wouldn't wander to dark places. The Whitmores' marriage survived, but it was strained. They dealt with grief in opposite ways, Carol keeping everything open and raw, Jim bottling everything up. Some nights they'd sit in silence, the TV playing unwatched, both of them thinking about Daniel, but not speaking about him. The absence between them wider than words could cross. The private investigator Novak, who'd worked the case in 1984, kept in touch with the Whitmores even after his paid work ended. He'd call on anniversaries, asking if there was anything new. He'd follow up on tips that seemed promising, doing it pro bono because he cared, because he'd gotten invested, because a case like this didn't let you go. In 1995, Novak contacted the Whitmores with new information. Advances in DNA analysis meant the swabs taken from Daniel's truck in 1984 could now be tested more accurately. The sheriff's office agreed to send the samples to a private lab that specialized in cold cases. The results came back confirming what they'd known. The DNA wasn't Daniel's, belonged to someone else, but without a suspect to compare it to, the information was useless. When they catch whoever did this, Novak told Carol, that DNA will seal the conviction. It's just a matter of finding them. But years kept passing. The 20th anniversary came and went. Daniel would have been 46 years old, probably married, maybe with children, definitely still making photographs. Carol imagined the life he might have lived, all the moments he'd missed, all the photographs he'd never taken. The turn of the millennium brought a surge of interest in cold cases as TV shows and documentaries popularized the genre. The Chronicle was contacted by producers interested in featuring Daniel's disappearance. Carol and Jim debated whether to participate. Would it help, bringing renewed attention to the case? Or would it just reopen wounds that hadn't healed? They agreed to one documentary that aired on a regional cable channel in 2002. The producers were respectful, focusing on Daniel's life and work rather than sensationalizing his disappearance. The show generated a few new tips, people who'd moved to Oregon after 1984 and hadn't known about the case. Again, nothing led anywhere. By 2010, Daniel had been missing for 26 years. His parents were in their 70s now, Jim's health declining, Carol slowing down, but still determined. The case file in the sheriff's office ran to thousands of pages. A mountain of dead ends and false leads and procedures followed perfectly, but yielding nothing. The detectives who'd worked the original investigation had retired or died. Sheriff Bradley passed away in 2003, taking with him the memory of standing in that parking lot in March 1984, knowing in his gut that something terrible had happened. Carl Morrison from the Chronicle died in 2007, never knowing what became of the young photographer he'd mentored. Kevin, Daniel's former roommate, visited Bandon in 2010, bringing his teenage son to show him where he'd grown up. They stopped at the Whitmore house, and Kevin introduced his son to Carol. "This is my friend Daniel's mother," he said. "Daniel was one of the best people I ever knew." The boy asked what happened to Daniel, and Carol told the story again, carefully edited for a teenager's ears. The boy listened with wide eyes, then asked, "Don't they have DNA now? Can't they use that to find who did it?" Kevin and Carol shared a sad look. "DNA only works if you have someone to compare it to," Carol explained. "We have DNA from Daniel's truck, but unless the person gets arrested for something else and their DNA goes into the system, we might never know." But that conversation stuck with Carol. DNA was advancing rapidly, new techniques being developed. Maybe someday there would be a breakthrough. Maybe someday science would catch up with whoever had taken her son. The system found matches. Third cousins, fourth cousins, people who shared a common ancestor with the person who'd sat in Daniel's truck. Genealogist C.C. Moore began building a family tree, working backward through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, death certificates. It took 4 months of painstaking research. The family tree grew larger, more complex, branches spreading across 3 states. But slowly, a picture emerged. The DNA belonged to someone descended from a German immigrant family that had settled in Washington in the 1890s. By July 2019, Moore had narrowed the possibilities to 3 men. All were the right age. All had lived in the Pacific Northwest in 1984. Detective Chen began investigating each one, pulling driver's license photos, vehicle registrations, employment records. The first man had been in Alaska in March 1984, working on a fishing boat. Eliminated. The second man had died in 1997, cancer, leaving no indication he'd ever been to Oregon. Probably eliminated, but Chen kept him in the maybe pile. The third man was named Robert Keller, lived in Olympia, Washington now, had lived in Salem in 1984. Age 62, retired, married, 2 adult children, coached youth basketball, volunteered at a food bank. Chen pulled his 1984 driver's license photo. The man staring back at the camera had sandy hair going gray, wire-rimmed glasses, a generic handsomeness that made him instantly forgettable. She checked vehicle registrations. In 1984, Robert Keller had owned a dark blue Ford Econoline van. Her heart rate kicked up. She called the DA's office. They needed a warrant for Robert Keller's DNA. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning in October 2019, at the food bank where Robert Keller was sorting canned goods with a dozen other volunteers. He looked surprised when the detectives identified themselves, but not panicked. Not yet. "Mr. Keller, we need to talk to you about an incident in March of 1984. Would you be willing to come down to the station?" 1984? That's 35 years ago. What incident? "We'd prefer to discuss it at the station. You're not under arrest. We just need to ask some questions." Robert agreed, even riding in the detective's car voluntarily, chatting pleasantly about the weather. At the station, they led him to an interview room, offered coffee, water. He declined both. "Mr. Keller, do you remember being in the Bandon, Oregon area in March of 1984? "Bandon? I don't think so. I was living in Salem then." "Do you remember meeting someone to buy a camera? A Rolleiflex?" Something flickered behind Robert's eyes, there and gone so quickly, Chen almost missed it. "A camera? No, I don't remember anything like that." "We have DNA evidence that places you in a truck belonging to Daniel Whitmore, a photographer who disappeared from Bandon on March 14, 1984. Can you explain how your DNA would be in his truck?" Robert's face remained calm, but his hands tensed on the table. "I think you've made a mistake. I've never heard of Daniel Whitmore." Chen opened a folder, pulled out a photograph. Daniel smiling at the camera, one of his restored cameras in his hands. "This is Daniel Whitmore, 26 years old, photographer, camera restoration hobbyist. He placed an ad selling a Rolleiflex. Someone named Robert called him. They agreed to meet at Whiskey Run Beach. Daniel was never seen again. That's terrible, but it wasn't me. Your DNA says it was you. DNA can be contaminated. Tests can be wrong. We'd like to take a voluntary DNA sample, if you're willing to cooperate. Robert smiled, a thin, careful expression. I think I'd like to speak with a lawyer now. The questioning stopped. Robert's lawyer arrived within 2 hours, a sharp-dressed woman from Seattle, who advised her client to say nothing. But the warrant for Robert's DNA was already signed. They swabbed his cheek. The sample went to the lab. 2 weeks later, the results came back. Direct match. The DNA in Daniel's truck belonged to Robert Keller. The odds of it being anyone else were 1 in several trillion. They arrested Robert on November 1st, 2019, charging him with aggravated murder, kidnapping, and theft. The press conference made national news. 35-year-old cold case solved through genetic genealogy. Jim and Carol Whitmore, now in their late 70s, sat in the front row, holding hands, tears streaming down their faces. But when reporters asked how Daniel had died, where his body was, Detective Chen had to shake her head. We're still investigating. We hope Mr. Keller will provide that information. Robert Keller, arraigned in his food bank volunteer shirt, pleaded not guilty. His lawyer argued that DNA in a truck didn't prove murder, only that Robert had been in the vehicle at some point. Maybe Daniel had given him a ride. Maybe they'd met for a legitimate camera transaction, and Daniel had driven off afterward, meeting foul play from someone else. But investigators kept digging, and the case against Robert Keller grew stronger. They found his 1984 work records. He'd been a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative, his territory covering Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. His job gave him reason to be on remote highways, meeting strangers, explaining away odd behavior. They found his phone records. In March 1984, he'd called the Whitmore residence 3 times. Once on March 17th, 3 days after Daniel disappeared. Jim Whitmore had kept the answering machine tape, stored in a shoebox with other mementos. The voice on the tape was calm, friendly. Hi, this is Robert calling about the Rolleiflex. I was supposed to meet Daniel on Wednesday, but something came up on my end. Is he still interested in selling? He can call me back at this number. The investigators ran the number. Another payphone, this one outside a gas station in Eugene. A psychological manipulation, experts said. By calling and acting concerned, Robert could find out if police suspected anything. The call also served as misdirection, suggesting he'd never actually met Daniel, that their appointment had been missed due to Robert's scheduling conflict. They searched Robert's property in Olympia, the house he'd owned since 1991. In the garage, buried under boxes of Christmas decorations, they found a metal toolbox containing old maps, including one of the Oregon coast with Bandon circled in pencil. They found photographs of Robert from the 1980s, always alone, always in places where you couldn't quite pin down the location. And they found, wrapped in a stained cloth, a Rolleiflex camera. The serial number matched Daniel's camera perfectly. Robert had kept it for 35 years, hidden but not destroyed. When asked why, a forensic psychologist would later testify that some killers keep trophies, physical reminders of their acts, objects that let them revisit the crime whenever they wished. Robert's wife, Diane, was devastated. I had no idea, she told investigators. He's been a good husband, a good father. He volunteers, for God's sake. How could he do this? But when detectives interviewed Robert's adult children, his neighbors, his co-workers, they got the same description. Quiet, controlled, pleasant, but distant. No one really knew him. He was the kind of person who made small talk, but never revealed anything personal, who could spend an hour in conversation without saying anything meaningful. One former coworker remembered something. Back in the late 80s, we had this conversation about a trip to the Oregon coast. I mentioned I'd stayed in Bandon. Robert got this look on his face, real intense, and asked me all these questions about the town, what it looked like, if it had changed much. At the time, I thought he was just interested. Looking back, it seemed like he was checking on something. The trial began in March 2021, exactly 37 years after Daniel vanished. Jim Whitmore had died 6 months earlier, his heart finally giving out. Carol attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row, her eyes never leaving Robert Keller's face. The prosecution's case was methodical and damning. They presented the DNA evidence, explaining genetic genealogy in terms the jury could understand. They showed how Robert's work records placed him in Oregon at the right time. They played the answering machine tape, Robert's voice cheerful and unconcerned 3 days after Daniel disappeared. They presented the Rolleiflex camera, Daniel's camera, found in Robert's garage. The serial numbers matched Daniel's purchase receipt, which his parents had saved. They called Kevin, Daniel's roommate, now 57 and gray-haired, who described Daniel as careful and trusting, someone who'd never just disappear. They called Carl Morrison from the Chronicle, retired now, who testified that Daniel was reliable, responsible, not the kind of person to vanish without telling anyone. They called the forensic genealogist, who explained how she'd built the family tree that led to Robert Keller. The jury listened, rapt, as she described the painstaking process of connecting genetic matches across generations. The defense argued that the case was circumstantial. DNA in a truck proved contact, not murder. The camera could have been sold legitimately, then Robert had simply kept it. The phone calls could be explained by genuine interest in completing the sale. Where was Daniel's body? How could you convict someone of murder without a body? But the prosecution had one more piece of evidence, saved for maximum impact. A cellmate of Robert's had come forward, claiming Robert had confessed while awaiting trial. Robert had described luring Daniel to the remote location, hitting him with a tire iron, driving him far into the Coast Range forests, where logging roads penetrated deep into the wilderness. He said he panicked, the cellmate testified. Said he just wanted to rob the guy, take the camera without paying. But when he hit him harder than he meant to, and the guy wasn't moving right. He knew he had to get rid of him. He drove for hours, found a spot where they'd done clear cutting a few years back. All these logging roads nobody used anymore. He buried him there, under debris from the logging. Said the forest had grown back over it. No one would ever find him. The defense attacked the cellmate's credibility. He was a career criminal, they said, looking for a deal on his own case. But his description matched details that had never been made public, small facts about Daniel's camera bag, about the make and model of Daniel's truck. Robert Keller never testified. His lawyer advised against it, knowing that prosecutors would tear him apart on cross-examination. So he sat silent through 3 weeks of testimony, his face a mask of polite attention, revealing nothing. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Aggravated murder, kidnapping, theft. At sentencing, Carol Whitmore was allowed to speak. She stood at the podium, this small woman in her late 70s, and looked directly at Robert Keller. "You took my son," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "You took him for a camera, for $400. You took 37 years of his life, all the things he would have done, the family he would have had. You took 37 years of our lives, every birthday wondering, every Christmas with an empty chair, every time the phone rang hoping it was him. She paused, wiping her eyes. My husband died without ever knowing what happened to Daniel. That was your gift to us. Uncertainty, torment. But at least now I know. At least now Daniel has justice. Robert Keller showed no reaction. His face remained blank, the same pleasant mask he'd worn through the entire trial. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without possibility of parole. At 64 years old, Robert Keller would die in prison, just as Daniel Whitmore had died at 26 in some forgotten logging road clearing. But one question remained unanswered. Where was Daniel buried? After sentencing, Detective Chen visited Robert in prison one final time. "Tell me where he is," she said. "Give his mother that much. Let her bury her son." Robert smiled, that same thin, controlled expression. "I have nothing to say. She's 77 years old. She won't live forever. Give her peace." "I was convicted without a body," Robert said. "The jury believed I killed him without proof. So what do I gain by telling you where he is?" Chen tried everything. Offered better prison conditions, transfers to facilities closer to his family, anything she could think of. Robert refused. Giving up Daniel's location was the only power he had left, the only way he could still control the narrative. He would take that secret to his grave. Today, Robert Keller sits in the Oregon State Penitentiary, serving his life sentence. He maintains his innocence in letters to supporters, claiming he was framed by faulty DNA science, wrongly convicted by a system too willing to believe genetic genealogy evidence. Carol Whitmore still lives in Bandon, in the same house where Daniel grew up. She's 81 now, her health failing. She keeps Daniel's restored cameras in a glass cabinet, perfectly preserved, waiting for him. Every year on March 14th, she drives up to Whiskey Run Beach, stands in the parking lot where Daniel's truck was found, and leaves flowers at a small memorial plaque the town installed. The case changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. The success of genetic genealogy in solving Daniel's disappearance led to dozens of other cold cases being reopened, evidence retested, family trees constructed. Killers who thought they'd gotten away with murder decades ago suddenly found themselves in handcuffs, their DNA betraying them across the years. The Coos County Sheriff's Office still searches periodically for Daniel's remains. They've used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, volunteer searches of old logging areas in the Coast Range. Nothing. The forest keeps its secrets. But in another sense, Daniel Whitmore has never been lost. His photographs still hang in the Chronicle's newsroom, images of a coastal town in a vanished era. The cameras he restored are preserved, testament to his skill and patience. The people who knew him remember not how he died, but how he lived. His kindness, his quiet enthusiasm for his craft, his ability to see beauty in ordinary moments. At Daniel's memorial service in 2019, after Robert Keller's conviction, more than 200 people attended. Friends from high school, colleagues from the Chronicle, other photographers who'd learned from him. They shared stories, showed photographs Daniel had taken, passed around cameras he'd restored. Kevin, his former roommate, spoke about Daniel's generosity, how he'd give away cameras to kids who showed interest in photography, wanting to share his passion. Carl Morrison, Daniel's old editor, now 92 years old, stood slowly and told a story. A month before Daniel disappeared, he shot a photograph of an elderly woman who'd just received an award for 50 years of volunteer work at the hospital. He spent an hour with her, getting her comfortable, talking about her life. When I saw the print, I knew it was special. You could see everything she was in that picture. her pride, her humility, her kindness. That was Daniel's gift. He saw people clearly. The photograph Morrison described hangs now in Bandon's small historical museum, part of a permanent exhibit of Daniel's work. Tourists pass it every day, not knowing the story of the young man who took it, who captured a moment and made it eternal, who understood that the click of a shutter could preserve something essential about a person, a place, a time. In a sense, Daniel Whitmore achieved the immortality every artist dreams of. His work outlived him. His vision persists. The moments he captured still speak across the decades, saying this mattered, this person mattered, this light falling just so on this particular afternoon in this particular town by the ocean mattered. But Carol Whitmore would trade all of it, every photograph, every camera, every word of praise, for one more day with her son. She would trade everything for the chance to bury him properly, to put flowers on his grave, to know where he lies. That's the cruelty of cases like this. Justice, when it finally comes, brings answers, but not peace. Carol knows what happened to Daniel, knows who killed him, knows he's gone forever. But the not knowing where transforms into a different kind of torture. Somewhere in the forests of the Coast Range, Daniel's remains lie waiting. Every dark stand of trees could be the place. Every logging road could lead to him. Robert Keller knows. He alone carries that knowledge, the precise location where he left Daniel's body 37 years ago. It's the last power he has, the final secret he can control, and he guards it jealously, knowing that giving it up means surrendering the last part of the crime that's still his alone. The case files on Daniel Whitmore run to thousands of pages now. Interview transcripts, forensic reports, genetic genealogy analyses, trial transcripts. They tell the story of a young man who loved cameras and photography, who met a monster in a parking lot on a foggy March afternoon, who disappeared into silence for 35 years until science caught up with the person who killed him. But they don't tell the story of what happened in those final hours, what Daniel thought, what he felt, whether he knew what was coming. They don't describe the exact location where he's buried, the trees that stand above him, the forest floor that holds him. That story remains untold, locked in Robert Keller's silence, waiting for the day when a hiker stumbles across something in the woods, or heavy rains expose what's been hidden, or Robert Keller's conscience finally breaks the way Daniel's skull broke under the tire iron. Until then, Carol Whitmore keeps vigil. She keeps Daniel's cameras polished, his photographs preserved, his memory alive. She grants interviews to journalists, hoping that publicity might pressure Robert into revealing where Daniel lies. She writes letters to parole boards Robert will never see, reminding them of what he took, what he refuses to give back. And every March 14th, she drives to Whiskey Run Beach, stands where Daniel stood for the last time, and speaks to him across the years. Tells him she hasn't forgotten. Tells him justice came, incomplete though it was. Tells him she loves him, misses him, wishes more than anything that she could bring him home. The waves crash on the rocks below. The fog rolls in from the ocean. The coastal pines bend in the wind. And somewhere in the forest's inland, Daniel Whitmore rests in an unmarked grave, waiting to be found, waiting to be brought home, waiting for the day when all secrets are finally revealed and all debts finally paid. His camera bag still sits in his mother's house, the lenses still clean, the film still ready. As if Daniel might walk through the door any moment, ready to grab his gear and head out to shoot the evening light, ready to capture one more moment, freeze one more instant, preserve one more piece of the world before it's lost forever. But Daniel won't walk through that door. He won't shoot that photograph. The moments he might have captured are gone, unrealized, lost to the crime that took him. All that remains is the work he did, the cameras he restored, the photographs he made, and the memory of a young man who saw the world through a viewfinder and found it worth preserving. In the end, maybe that's the best memorial any of us can hope for. Not monuments or plaques, but the work we leave behind, the moments we captured, the small ways we made the world more beautiful or more understood. Daniel Whitmore's photographs still do that, still speak across the years, still say that this mattered, this light, this face, this moment in time when the shutter opened and closed and something essential was preserved. The rest is silence and waiting, and a mother's love that refuses to let go, that keeps hoping against hope that one day, somehow, her son will come home.